Hello, and welcome to the Tricky Topics Review for the upcoming midterm. This review will cover difficult topics discussed in Chapter 1, the story of psychology and thinking critically, Chapter 2, the biology of mind, and Chapter 3, sensation and perception. Our first topic is the scientific method, which is a systematic approach used by psychologists and scientists in various fields to investigate and understand natural phenomena, including those related to human behavior and cognition. It consists of a series of steps that help researchers formulate and test hypotheses, gather and analyze data, and draw conclusions. In psychology, the scientific method is applied to study and explain various aspects of human behavior, thoughts, and emotions. Here are the key steps of the psychology scientific method. Step 1. Psychologists develop specific research questions that they aim to answer through systematic investigation. These questions are often framed to be testable and measurable. For example, a psychologist is interested in understanding the relationship between stress levels and memory performance. They observe that some students in their college appear to perform poorly on exams during periods of high stress, while others seem to do just as well or even better. This observation leads to the following research question: does high stress negatively impact memory performance in college students? Step 2. A hypothesis is a testable prediction or explanation for the observed phenomenon. It is a statement that specifies an expected relationship between variables. In psychology, hypotheses are often derived from existing theories or prior research. In the example, based on their research question, the psychologist forms a hypothesis: high levels of stress will lead to a decrease in memory performance among college students. Step 3. Researchers decide which research method to complete: descriptive, correlational, or experimental. Researchers collect data by conducting experiments, surveys, observations, or other methods, depending on the research design. They gather information from participants or subjects in a systematic and standardized manner. In the example, to test their hypothesis, the psychologist decided on an experiment design. They recruit a sample of college students and randomly divide them into two groups, a stress group and a control group. In the stress group, these participants will undergo a stress-inducing task, such as solving complex math problems under time pressure, to simulate a high-stress condition. In the control group, these participants will engage in a non-stressful activity, like watching a relaxing video. Both groups will then be given a memory test, where they need to memorize and recall a list of words. This acts as the dependent variable. Step 4. After collecting data, researchers use statistical and analytical techniques to examine the data and determine whether their results support or reject their hypotheses. Common statistical methods in psychology include t-tests, ANOVA, regression analysis, and correlation analysis. Based on the data analysis, researchers draw conclusions regarding whether their hypotheses are supported or not. These conclusions should be based on evidence and should address the research question. In the example, the psychologist records the number of words each participant from both groups correctly recalls. The data collected from both groups are analyzed using statistical methods. The psychologist uses a t-test to compare the mean number of words recalled by the stress group and the control group. They find that the stress group recalled significantly fewer words than the control group. Based on the data analysis, the psychologist concludes that high levels of stress have a negative impact on memory performance in college students. This conclusion supports their hypothesis. Step 5. Researchers share their findings with the scientific community and the public through peer-reviewed journals, conferences, and other forms of scientific communication. This allows for the dissemination of knowledge and the ongoing advancement of the field. Scientific research often involves the replication of studies by other researchers. Replication helps ensure the reliability and validity of research findings. If multiple studies consistently support a hypothesis, it adds strength to the scientific understanding of a phenomenon. In the example, the psychologist writes a research paper detailing the methods, results, and conclusions of their study. They submit it to a peer-reviewed psychology journal for publication, allowing other researchers to access and evaluate their work. To ensure the reliability of the findings, other researchers in the field may conduct similar experiments with different samples of college students. If multiple studies consistently find that stress negatively affects memory performance, it strengthens the validity of the conclusion. Step 6. When a hypothesis is supported by multiple studies and becomes well established, it can contribute to the development or refinement of psychological theories. Theories are broader explanations that encompass a range of related phenomena. In the example, over time, as more research supports the relationship between stress and memory performance, this finding may contribute to the development or refinement of theories about stress and cognitive functioning in psychology. The psychology scientific method is repetitive, with researchers continually building on existing knowledge and refining their hypotheses and research methods. It is a critical tool for advancing our understanding of human behavior and cognition in a systematic and evidence-based manner. Psychological research designs are systematic approaches that psychologists use to investigate and understand various aspects of human behavior and mental processes. There are several research designs in psychology, but here are three fundamental ones. Descriptive research. Descriptive research is primarily concerned with providing a detailed and accurate description of a phenomenon or behavior. It is often used when researchers want to gain an initial understanding of a topic or when they cannot manipulate variables. Descriptive research methods include observational studies, case studies, surveys, and content analysis. Observational studies involve carefully watching and recording behaviors in their natural settings. Case studies involve an in-depth examination of a single individual or a small group. Surveys involve gathering information through questionnaires or interviews. While descriptive research is valuable for generating hypotheses and providing a detailed overview of a subject, it is often the first step in exploring new topics. It does not establish causal relationships between variables, and it may be subject to biases or limitations of the methods used. For example, imagine a researcher who wants to understand the behavior of children in a naturalistic setting, such as a playground. The researcher goes to a local playground and observes children's play behaviors without intervening or manipulating any variables. They carefully record how children interact with each other, what games they play, and any instances of conflict or cooperation. This observational study provides a detailed description of the children's behavior in a real-world context. Correlational research is used to examine the relationship between two or more variables. It assesses how changes in one variable are associated with changes in another variable without manipulating them. Researchers collect data on variables of interest and analyze their statistical correlation. Correlation coefficients quantify the strength and direction of the relationship between variables. Positive correlations indicate that as one variable increases, the other tends to increase, while negative correlations suggest that as one variable increases, the other tends to decrease. Correlational research can identify associations between variables, making it useful for hypothesis generation and identifying patterns in data. However, correlation does not imply causation, it only reveals associations. Other factors may be responsible for the observed relationships, and the direction of causality cannot be determined. For example, a psychologist is interested in studying the relationship between the amount of time people spend on social media and their self-reported levels of loneliness. They collect data from a sample of 200 adults, measuring the number of hours spent on social media per day and their self-reported feelings of loneliness using standardized questionnaires. After analyzing the data, the psychologist finds a statistically significant negative correlation between social media usage and loneliness, suggesting that as social media usage increases, loneliness tends to decrease. Experimental research design. Experimental research is used to establish cause and effect relationships between variables. Researchers manipulate one or more independent variables and measure their effects on dependent variables. In an experiment, researchers create two or more groups, an experimental group that receives a specific treatment or manipulation, and a control group that does not. The key is to control for all other variables except the independent variables. Random assignment helps ensure that participants are equally likely to be in either group. Experimental research allows researchers to draw causal conclusions and manipulate variables to investigate their effects. It provides a higher degree of control over extraneous factors. Some phenomena cannot be studied through experiments due to ethical or practical constraints. Also, experiments may not always accurately reflect real-world conditions, and the results may not generalize to broader populations. For example, a pharmaceutical company is testing a new medication for treating depression. They recruit a group of 100 individuals diagnosed with depression and randomly assign them to two groups, an experimental group that receives the new medication and a control group that receives a placebo, a sugar pill with no active ingredients. The researchers measure the participants' depressive symptoms before and after the treatment period. After analyzing the data, they find that the experimental group shows a significant reduction in depressive symptoms compared to the control group. In this experiment, the manipulation of the medication is the independent variable, and the change in depressive symptoms is the dependent variable, allowing the researchers to conclude that the medication had a causal effect on reducing depression symptoms. Neuron. A neuron, also known as a nerve cell, is the fundamental building block of the nervous system. Neurons are specialized cells that transmit information in the form of electrical and chemical signals. They consist of several important parts, include the central part of the neuron and contains the nucleus, which houses the cell's genetic material, DNA. It plays a crucial role in maintaining the cell's metabolic functions. Dendrites are branching extensions that protrude from the cell body. They receive incoming signals from other neurons or sensory receptors. Dendrites are covered in synapses, which are specialized structures that allow communication between. The axon is a long, thin, and cable-like projection that extends from the cell body. It is responsible for transmitting electrical impulses, known as action potentials, away from the cell body and toward other neurons or target cells. The axon is insulated by a fatty substance called myelin, which helps speed up the conduction of electrical signal. Myelin sheath. Some axons are surrounded by a myelin sheath. The myelin sheath acts as an insulating layer that increases the speed of nerve impulse conduction along the axon. Neural communication, often referred to as synaptic communication or neurotransmission, is the process by which neurons in the nervous system communicate with each other and with target cells, such as muscle cells or gland cells. An action potential is a brief but rapid change in the electrical potential, voltage, of a neuron cell membrane, which allows neurons to transmit electrical signals over long distances. Here is a brief description of the process. When a neuron is at rest, not firing, the inside of the neuron has a slight negative electrical charge compared to the outside. This is referred to as the neuron's resting potential. B. When a neuron is stimulated, more positively charged particles flow into the cell, making the inside suddenly positive compared to the outside of the cell. This sudden reversal is the action potential. See immediately after the neuron fires, some positive particles are actively pumped out of D. The neuron returns to its resting potential and is ready to fire again if stimulated. The next part of neural communication involves synaptic transmission and receptor binding. When an action potential reaches the axon terminals, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters from synaptic vesicles into the synapse, which is the small gap between the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrites or cell body of the postsynaptic neuron or the target cell. Neurotransmitters released into the synapse bind to specific receptors on the membrane of the receiving neuron or target cell. These receptors are often proteins or protein complexes that are sensitive to the particular neurotransmitter. Neural communication allows for the rapid and precise transmission of information in the nervous system, enabling various functions such as sensory perception, motor control, cognition, and regulation of physiological processes. It is a fundamental process that underlies all brain and nervous system activities. The nervous system is a complex network of specialized cells and structures that work together to transmit and process information in the body. It can be divided into several different systems, each with its own functions and components. Central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. It serves as the command center of the body, processing sensory information, making decisions, and sending commands to the rest of the body. The brain is responsible for higher-level cognitive functions, such as thinking, memory, and emotion. The spinal cord plays a crucial role in relaying sensory information to the brain and transmitting motor commands from the brain to the muscles and organs. The peripheral nervous system includes all the nerves and ganglia, the clusters of nerve cell bodies, that are located outside the central nervous system. It is divided into two main components, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary movements and sensory perception. It enables conscious control over skeletal muscles, allowing us to perform actions like walking, talking, and reaching. Sensory neurons in the somatic nervous system transmit information about touch, pain, temperature, and other sensations to the central nervous system for processing. The autonomic nervous system regulates involuntary functions and maintains homeostasis in the body. It is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, which often have opposing effects on various bodily functions. The sympathetic division is responsible for the fight or flight response, activating during stress or emergency. It increases heart rate, dilates pupils, and redirects blood flow to muscles. The parasympathetic division promotes rest and digest activities, helping to conserve energy and maintain bodily functions during periods of relaxation. It slows heart rate, constricts pupils, and stimulates digestion. The brain has a hierarchical structure with multiple levels of organization, each responsible for different functions and processes. These levels interact and work together to enable a wide range of cognitive and physiological functions. The hindbrain is one of the three major divisions of the brain, along with the forebrain and the midbrain. It is located at the rear and base of the brain and plays a critical role in controlling essential functions. The medulla is the lowest part of the brainstem and connects the spinal cord to the brain. It is responsible for controlling vital autonomic functions such as respirations, heart rates, swallowing and digestions, and reflexes. The pons is located above the medulla and serves as a bridge between different parts of the brain. It is involved in various functions, including respiration, sleep, facial movements, hearing, balance, and spatial awareness. The cerebellum is a prominent structure located at the back of the brain, just below the occipital lobes of the cerebrum. It is essential for motor coordination, balance, and precision of movement. The midbrain is a region of the brain located between the hindbrain and the forebrain. It plays a crucial role in various sensory and motor functions, as well as in regulating arousal and consciousness. The reticular formation is a complex network of neurons located in the brainstem, extending from the hindbrain to the midbrain and into the upper part of the spinal cord. It plays a crucial role in regulating various physiological and behavioral functions, including arousal, attention, sleep-wake cycles, and the coordination of motor function. The forebrain is the largest and most complex region of the brain and plays a central role in various cognitive, emotional, and sensory functions. It is involved in processes such as thinking, memory, emotion, perception, and voluntary motor control. The limbic system is a group of interconnected structures located within the forebrain. The hypothalamus regulates various autonomic functions, including hunger, thirst, body temperature, and the endocrine system. The amygdala is involved in processing and regulating emotions, particularly fear and aggression. The hippocampus is essential for the formation of new memories and spatial navigation. The thalamus serves as the brain switchboard for sensory information. It receives sensory input from various sensory pathways and relays it to the appropriate regions of the cerebral cortex for further processing. It also plays a role in consciousness, alertness, and attention. The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain and plays a central role in many complex brain functions, including perception, cognition, language, memory, and voluntary movement. It is divided into different regions, each with specific functions and characteristics. Here are the key parts of the cerebral cortex. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the cerebral cortex, near the base of the skull. It is primarily responsible for processing visual information received from the eyes. The primary visual cortex, found in the occipital lobe, is where visual input is first processed, allowing us to perceive shapes, colors, and the temporal lobe is located on the sides of the cerebral cortex, roughly above the ear. This lobe is involved in auditory processing and language comprehension. It also plays a role in recognition and memory formation and emotional processing. The temporal lobe contains the primary auditory cortex, which receives and processes auditory. The parietal lobe is located near the top and back of the cerebral cortex, behind the frontal. It is primarily responsible for processing sensory information from the body, including touch, temperature, and pain. The somatosensory cortex, found in the parietal lobe, plays a key role in processing tactile sensations and spatial awareness. The frontal lobe is located at the front of the cerebral cortex. This region is associated with higher cognitive functions, including reasoning, planning, problem-solving, decision-making, personality, and voluntary muscle movement. It also contains the motor cortex, which controls voluntary muscle movement. Throughout the cerebral cortex, there are areas known as association areas that integrate information from various sensory and motor regions. These areas are critical for higher-order cognitive functions, including complex thought processes, memory retrieval, language comprehension, and problem-solving. The prefrontal cortex is located in all lobes and is involved in executive functions, such as working memory, attention, and impulse. It's important to note that the functions of the cerebral cortex are highly interconnected, and many cognitive processes involve multiple areas working together. Additionally, the cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres, left and right, each of which is associated with specific functions, but they also collaborate extensively for most tasks. The study of the cerebral cortex and its functions is a central focus of neuroscience and psychology. Sensation and perception are two distinct but interconnected processes that play essential roles in how we experience and interpret the world around. Sensation refers to the process by which sensory receptors such as those in the eyes, ears, skin, nose, and tongue detect and receive external stimuli, such as light, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Sensation involves the conversion of physical stimuli into electrical signals, which are then transmitted to the brain for processing. It is the first step in the chain of information processing that leads to perception. For example, when you touch a hot object, specialized sensory receptors in your skin detect the temperature and send signals to your brain, signaling that the object is hot. Perception is the process by which the brain organizes and interprets sensory information to create a meaningful and conscious experience of the world. It involves making sense of the sensory input and forming a mental representation of the environment. Function. Perception goes beyond mere detection and involves the brain's higher-level processing, including pattern recognition, memory, and contextual understanding. It allows us to recognize objects, interpret their meaning, and construct a coherent and meaningful picture of our surroundings. For example, when you look at a cup of coffee, perception enables you to not only see the cup, but also recognize it as a familiar object used for holding liquids. You perceive the color, shape, and size of the cup and associate it with the concept of cup. Vision sensation is the initial stage of visual processing in which the sensory receptors in the eyes detect and receive visual stimuli from the environment. When viewing a red object, the stimuli sensed by eyes are pulses of electromagnetic energy that is perceived as red by visual systems. Light travels in waves, which influences the visual input. Wavelength determines hue, the color we experience, such as the tulip's red petals or green leaves. A light wave's amplitude, or height, determines its intensity, the amount of energy the wave contains. Intensity influences brightness of color. Light enters the eye through the cornea, which bends light to help provide focus. The light then passes through the pupil, a small adjustable opening. Surrounding the pupil and controlling its size is the iris, a colored muscle that dilates or constricts in response to light intensity. The iris responds to your cognitive and emotional states. After passing through your pupil, light hits the transparent lens in your eye. The lens then focuses the light rays into an image on your retina, the multilayered tissue on the eyeball's sensitive inner surface. Once the light reaches the very back of the eye, it reaches the retina's nearly 130 million buried photoreceptor cells, the rods and cones. The light energy triggers chemical changes. That chemical reaction would spark neural signals in nearby bipolar cells. The bipolar cells activate neighboring ganglion cells, whose axons twine together to form the optic nerve. After a momentary stopover at the thalamus, the information moves on to the final destination, the visual cortex, in the occipital lobe at the back of your brain. Vision perception is the process by which the brain interprets and makes sense of the visual information received from the eyes. It goes beyond the initial detection of light and shapes, which is the role of vision sensation, and involves higher-level cognitive processes that enable us to recognize objects, understand spatial relationships, and perceive the world around us in a meaningful way. Before interpretation, the brain must determine what visual stimuli is relevant. Selective attention is a fundamental aspect of visual perception that involves focusing on specific aspects of the visual environment while ignoring other information. It allows individuals to filter out irrelevant or distracting stimuli and prioritize processing what is considered relevant or important. Feature detectors are specialized neurons in the visual system that respond selectively to specific features or characteristics of visual stimuli. These neurons are crucial for detecting and processing elementary visual elements, such as edges, lines, shapes, colors, and motion. Habituation involves a decrease in the responsiveness of sensory receptors, neurons, or the brain to a repeated or constant stimulus. Visual perception involves the organization and interpretation of visual information gathered by the eyes to create a coherent and meaningful representation of the visual world. The form is assessed to aid in perceiving any object as distinct from its surroundings and to group the stimuli into a meaningful. Perceptual constancy is when perceiving objects as unchanging, such as having consistent color, brightness, shape, and size even as illumination and retinal images change. Regardless of the viewing angle, distance, and illumination, we can identify people and things. Depth perception is the ability to see objects in 3 dimensions, although the images that strike the retina are 2-dimensional, allows us to judge distance. But binocular cue is a depth cue, such as retinal disparity, that depends on the use of 2. Monocular cue is a depth cue, such as relative height or linear perspective, available to either eye. Color and brightness constancy occurs as a perceived object retains the same color or brightness even though the amount of light. Form perception, depth perception, and constancies illuminate how we organize our visual experiences. Perception enables us to navigate and interact with the visual world, recognize objects, and make sense of the structures and patterns that surround us. Perpetual adaptation is the ability to adjust to changed sensory input, including an artificially displaced or even inverted visual field. For example, when putting on a virtual reality headset, an individual's vision adapts to the new perceptual set is the mental predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. For instance, visualizing the letter B different next to letters or numbers. Frame of reference serves as a spatial framework or context that allows the brain to interpret and understand the positions, relationships, and motions of objects within the visual. Bottom-up processing. Processing starts at sensory receptors and works up to higher levels of top-down processing, constructs perceptions from this sensory input by drawing on your experience and expectation. Bottom-up processing enables your sensory systems to detect the lines, angles, and colors that form the images. Using top-down processing, you interpret what your senses detect.